The silent servant. The kitchen stones were always cold, even in summer, and Wren Ashcroft had long since stopped feeling the chill in her knees as she scrubbed. 2,557 days. She counted them the way other people counted blessings. Each dawn, another tally mark scratched into the soft mortar behind the bread ovens where no one would see. 2,557 days since she had lost her voice, since the world had narrowed to the width of these four walls, and the endless, suffocating routine of survival. Her hands moved in practiced circles, the rough bristles of the brush scraping away congealed fat from the flagstones. And she did not think about the bleeding cracks in her palms, did not think about the way her spine ached from hours bent double, did not think about anything at all except the rhythm. Scrub, rinse, scrub, rinse. If she focused on the pattern, she could almost forget the weight of silence pressing against her throat like a hand that never let go. The kitchen was beginning to wake around her. She heard the shuffle of feet on the stairs, the muttered complaints of the baker's apprentice who always arrived late, the clang of pots being pulled from their hooks. Wren kept her head down, made herself smaller, invisible. That was the first rule of survival in this place. The mute girl who never looked up, never complained, never drew attention to herself, was the girl who might live through another day without Master Dunley's meaty hand cracking across her face, without Lady Verity's cold eyes finding some new fault to punish. She had learned invisibility the way other people learn to read, through necessity and repetition and the kind of desperation that carved itself into your bones. In the beginning, those first raw, agonizing weeks after they had brought her to the castle, she had tried to communicate, had gestured frantically, had written clumsy letters in spilled flour. But Master Dunley had beaten her for wasting food, and the other servants had turned away, uncomfortable with her desperation, perhaps afraid that whatever curse had stolen her voice might somehow be contagious. So she had learned to stop trying. She had learned that silence was not just the absence of sound, but a kind of armor, thick and suffocating, that kept the world at a distance, even as it slowly crushed the breath from her lungs. The memories of before were fragmented, sharp-edged pieces that cut when she tried to hold them. She remembered fire. She remembered screaming, though whether it had been her own screams or someone else's, she could no longer say. She remembered enormous shapes moving through smoke, wolves larger than any animal should be, and the wet sound of tearing, and her mother's hands pushing her down into darkness. And then nothing, a blade through the thread of her life, severing everything that had come before from everything that came after. They told her she had been lucky. Lady Verity herself had said it, that first day when Wren had woken in the healer's chambers with bandages around her throat and no voice to ask where she was, what had happened, why she could not remember. "You are fortunate, child. The wolves killed everyone else in Ashcroft. You should be grateful to be alive." And Wren, 15 years old and hollowed out with grief she could not name for people she could barely remember, had believed her. She believed it still. Ill, sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, when the counting did not help and the weight of all those silent days pressed down until she thought her ribs might crack, she was alive. That was something. Even if alive meant kneeling on cold stone, scrubbing away the evidence of other people's meals, even if it meant sleeping in a closet that smelled of mildew and mouse droppings, even if it meant the ache of loneliness so profound it had become a kind of companion, faithful and constant and utterly without comfort. The other servants were moving around her now, and Wren shifted back to let them pass, kept her eyes on the stones. She heard fragments of conversation, the usual gossip and complaints. The butcher's boy had been caught stealing, the Eastern Alpha was visiting next month, Lady Verity had ordered new tapestries for the Great Hall. Wren listened the way she always did, absorbing information she had no use for, filling the silence in her head with other people's words since she had none of her own. Mistress Blaine, the head cook, swept past with a basket of turnips and nearly kicked over Wren's bucket. She did not apologize. No one ever did. Wren simply moved the bucket, wrung out her rag, continued scrubbing. Another hour, and she would be allowed to eat the breakfast scraps, the burned porridge and stale bread that the other servants would not touch. Another hour, and then she would haul water from the well until her shoulders screamed. Another hour, and another, stretching forward into infinity, each one identical to the last. This was her life. This was all her life would ever be. And then the door at the top of the kitchen stairs slammed open, and Master Dunley's voice boomed down, thick with drink, though it was barely passed on. "You, mute girl, get up here, now." Wren's hands stilled. Fear, cold and familiar, slid down her spine. She was not often summoned, not unless someone needed a scapegoat for some minor disaster, a missing spoon, or a burnt roast. Slowly, she set down the brush, wiped her wet hands on her ragged skirt, and climbed to her feet. Her knees protested, stiff from kneeling, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. The other servants had gone quiet, watching with the bland curiosity of people observing a dog that might be kicked. She climbed the narrow stairs, each step an effort, and emerged into the corridor where Master Dunley waited. He was a stocky man, red-faced and sweating perpetually, and he looked at her now with an expression she could not read, something that might have been nervousness or spite or both. "Lady Verity wants you," he said, and there was satisfaction in his voice, the pleasure of someone passing along bad news. "You've done something to displease her. Best not keep her waiting." Wren's heart kicked against her ribs. Lady Verity, the high steward of the royal household, the king's distant cousin, a woman whose displeasure could mean anything from hours kneeling on dried peas to a whipping in the courtyard. Wren had always been careful, so careful, to avoid her attention, but somehow she had failed. Somehow she had been noticed. Master Dunley grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the thin flesh above her elbow, and dragged her forward. She stumbled, caught herself, allowed herself to be pulled through the castle corridors like a dog on a leash. They passed tapestries she had never seen, rooms she had never. Wren entered, climbing higher and higher, until they reached the wing where the nobles lived, where the air smelled of beeswax and lavender instead of sweat and smoke. Lady Verity's chambers were at the end of a long hall. Master Dunley shoved Wren through the door and then retreated, pulling it shut behind him, leaving her alone in a room that was all pale silks and polished wood. And there, standing by the window with her back to the door, was Lady Verity herself. She did not turn immediately. She let Wren stand there, shaking and silent, for a long moment before she spoke. "Do you know why you are here, girl?" Wren shook her head, the movement small, desperate. Lady Verity turned then, and her face was beautiful in the way that ice is beautiful, cold and sharp and perfect. "You were seen," she said quietly, "in the South Gardens 3 nights ago, after curfew, watching things that do not concern you." Wren's breath stopped. The meeting, the hooded figures, the velvet pouch changing hands. She had thought herself hidden in the shadows, thought no one had seen. She had been wrong. Lady Verity crossed the room, her silk skirts whispering, and Wren forced herself not to flinch, not to step back. "Curiosity is a dangerous quality in a servant," the woman continued, her pale eyes fixed on Wren's face. "Especially a servant who cannot speak of what she has seen. Tell me, child, do you think your silence makes you safe? Do you think it makes you trustworthy?" She reached out, almost gentle, and touched Wren's throat. Wren flinched then, could not help it, and Lady Verity smiled. There was no warmth in it. "No," she murmured, "your silence makes you a liability, because I can never be certain what you might find a way to say." She stepped back, gestured to the floor. "Kneel." Wren obeyed. What else could she do? Lady Verity crossed to a small table, returned with a linen bag. She poured its contents onto the floor in front of Wren. Dried peas, hundreds of them, rolling and scattering across the polished wood. "You will kneel here for 1 hour," Lady Verity said. and you will reflect on the importance of keeping one's eyes to oneself. Wren shifted her knees onto the peas. The pain was immediate, sharp, and grinding, and she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from gasping. Lady Verity settled into a chair, picked up a piece of embroidery, and began to stitch as though Wren were not there at all, as though the girl kneeling in silent agony were no more significant than a piece of furniture. Time became elastic, stretching and contracting. Wren focused on breathing, on counting the peas she could see, on anything except the fire in her knees. And as she knelt there, Lady Verity spoke, her voice light and conversational, describing how fortunate Wren was, how generous the castle had been to take in a half-mad child from a massacred village, how Wren owed everything to the mercy she had been shown. The hour passed, or perhaps it was longer. When Lady Verity finally dismissed her, Wren could barely stand. She limped back through the corridors, descended the stairs, returned to the kitchens. No one asked where she had been. No one cared. That night, in her tiny room, Wren sat on the edge of her straw mattress and ran her fingers over the scar tissue on her throat. She did not remember how it had gotten there. A wound from the massacre, they had told her. It had healed badly. It had stolen her voice. But sometimes, in dark, she wondered if that was true. Sometimes she thought she could almost remember other hands, a different pain, words spoken in a language she did not know. Sometimes she thought the silence was not an accident, but thinking changed nothing, so she lay down, closed her eyes, and began to count. 2,558 days. The King's Hunger. 3 days after the peas, after her knees had stopped bleeding and faded to mottled purple bruises, Wren was scrubbing pots in the scullery when Master Dunley appeared in the doorway. His face was flushed, whether from exertion or wine she could not tell, and his small eyes fixed on her with an expression that made her stomach clench with instinctive dread. "You," he said, jerking his chin toward her. "The king wants a late meal. You're to bring it to his private chambers." The pot Wren had been holding slipped from her fingers, clattered against the stone basin. Around her, the other kitchen workers had gone utterly silent, and she could feel their stares like brands against her skin. Scullery maids did not deliver food to the king. That task belonged to the senior servers, the trusted ones, the people whose faces and names the king might actually recognize. Sending Wren made no sense, unless someone wanted to ensure that, whatever happened, the person who delivered the meal could not speak of it afterward. Master Dunley was already turning away, gesturing impatiently. "The tray's ready. Don't keep him waiting. And don't touch anything. Just set it down and leave." Wren's hands were shaking as she dried them on her apron. She wanted to refuse, wanted to shake her head and back away, but refusal was not a language she spoke anymore. So she crossed to the table where the tray waited, lifted it, and felt the weight of it settle into her arms. It was heavy, laden with roasted meat and bread and a flagon of wine, and beneath the rich smell of cooked food there was something else, something faintly bitter that made the back of her throat itch. She knew that smell. Somewhere deep in the tangled ruins of her memory, she knew it. The walk through the castle felt endless. Wren climbed stairs she had never been allowed to climb, passed through corridors where the torches burned in silver sconces, and the tapestries depicted battles she did not recognize. Guards watched her pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt, but none of them stopped her. She was invisible again, a servant with a tray, beneath notice. The king's private chambers were in the highest tower. By the time Wren reached the final corridor, her arms were burning and her breath came short and shallow. The doors at the end of the hall were already open, and through them she could see a slice of the room beyond, all dark wood and fur pelts and the flicker of firelight. And standing at the window, a silhouette against the night sky, was the king himself. Wren had never seen him up close. King Torsten Ironmere was a figure from proclamations and distant ceremonies, a man whose presence in the castle was marked by increased patrols and hushed voices, but never by actual visibility. Now, as she stepped through the doorway, the tray trembling in her grip, she saw him fully for the first time. He was enormous, taller than any man she had ever seen, broad through the shoulders and chest in a way that suggested violence barely contained. His hair was long and silver white, and an unnatural color that seemed to glow in the firelight. And when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his eyes were amber. Not brown, not gold, but true amber, the color of honey held up to the sun. And they fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to bolt. "Set it down," he said, his voice rough, and gestured toward the table near the fire. Ren crossed the room, each step careful, hyper-conscious of the way the wine sloshed in the flagon, the way the meat glistened on its plate. She set the tray down, and as she did, that bitter smell rose stronger, and something in her chest clenched tight with warning. She looked at the meat, at the faint purplish sheen along the edge where the juices had pooled, and her heart began to hammer. Poison. The word surfaced from somewhere deep, a piece of knowledge she did not remember learning. Purple sheen meant nightshade, meant wolfsbane, meant death. She straightened, turned, and the king was already moving toward the table, his hand reaching for the plate. Ren did not think. She simply moved, stepping between him and the food, shaking her head violently, her hands coming up in a gesture that was half pleading, half command. The king stopped. His eyes, those impossible amber eyes, narrowed. "What are you doing?" Ren shook her head again, more frantically, pointed at the meat, at the purple tinge, tried to mime danger, tried to make him understand. But she had no voice, no words, and frustration rose in her throat like bile. She grabbed his wrist, pulled his hand away from the plate, and his skin was burning hot against her palm, fever bright. And the moment they touched, everything stopped. It was not a sound, not a sensation she could name. It was as though lightning had replaced her blood, as though every nerve in her body had been set alight simultaneously. A golden thread snapped taut between her chest and his, so sudden and so strong that she gasped, and no air came, and the world tilted sideways. The king made a noise, something between a growl and a gasp, and staggered backward. His free hand came up to clutch at his chest, clawing at the leather jerkin he wore, as though he could rip the sensation out. His eyes were blazing now, glowing so bright they lit the room. And Ren watched in frozen horror as his canines lengthened, as his fingernails darkened and curved into claws, as the air around him began to shimmer. "No," he rasped, the word barely human. "No, this is not. You cannot be." Ren's knees buckled. She went down hard, the tray clattering to the floor, food spilling across the stones. The golden thread between them was pulling tight, so tight she thought it might snap her in half, and she could feel him, his shock, his denial, his rage, his desperate, aching hope, all of it pouring into her in a flood that she had no way to process, no way to contain. She opened her mouth to scream, and nothing came out, not even air, just the same suffocating silence that had held her for 7 years. The king dropped to his knees across from her. He was shaking, his whole massive frame trembling, and he leaned forward, inhaling deeply, scenting her. "Pine smoke?" he murmured, his voice wrecked. "Lavender. And underneath, gods, how is this possible?" Ren tried to scramble backward, but her body would not obey. The bond, whatever this impossible thing was, held her pinned as surely as chains. The king reached out, slowly, as though approaching. Ouching a wild animal, and his clawed hand hovered near her face. "You," he said, 7 years I have waited. 7 years, and you were here. You were here the entire time." The door behind them slammed open. Ren flinched, and the king's head snapped up, a snarl ripping from his throat that made the furniture rattle. A woman stood in the doorway, tall and armored, a sword already drawn. Captain Briar Wolfsbane, head of the King's Guard, her scarred face set in grim lines. "My lord, what?" She stopped, her eyes going wide. Behind her, a man appeared, sandy-haired and broad-shouldered, and he took one look at the scene and went very still. Finn Greywater, the King's beta, his second. "Oh," he breathed. "Oh no." He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to his knees beside the spilled food. He did not touch it, just leaned close, inhaling carefully, and his expression went dark. "My lord, this is Wolfsbane and Nightshade, enough to kill you before morning." The King's growl deepened, became something that was no longer remotely human. Furniture began to shake. The fire in the hearth roared up, sparks scattering across the floor. Ren watched through the haze of overwhelming sensation as he rose to his feet, his whole body racked with transformation he was barely holding back. "Who," he snarled, "sent this food?" Finn looked at Ren, and his expression was unreadable. "Did you prepare this?" Ren shook her head frantically. Finn turned to Briar. "Find out who did. Find them now." But the King was not listening. His attention had snapped back to Ren, the bond pulling his focus like a leash, and he took a step toward her, then stopped himself with visible effort. "You saved my life," he said, and his voice was breaking, fracturing between human and animal. "And you cannot speak." It was not a question. He could feel it, she realized. Through the bond, he could feel the silence in her, the void where her voice should be. His face twisted with something that looked like anguish, and he dropped to his knees again, this time keeping distance between them, as though he did not trust himself to get closer. "What is your name?" Ren stared at him. She had no way to answer. No slate, no charcoal, nothing but her useless hands and her broken throat. She tried anyway, mouthing the letters slowly. W-R-E-N. "Ren," he repeated, watching her lips. "Ren." His eyes closed. The mate bond had found her at last, and she could not even tell him her name aloud. Finn was pulling Briar aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. "The bond scent," he was saying. "It is undeniable. She is his mate. But someone just tried to kill him, and she is the one who delivered the poison." "She saved him," Briar countered. "If she was part of the plot, why stop him from eating? Unless she lost her nerve. Unless this was a different plan entirely." Ren wanted to protest, to explain, but she had no words. She could only kneel there on the floor, surrounded by spilled food and broken pottery, while the 3 of them decided her fate. The King opened his eyes, and they were still glowing, still more wolf than man. "She is mine," he said, and his voice was flat, absolute. "Mine to protect, mine to question. No one touches her." He looked at Finn. "Move her to the rooms adjoining mine. Post guards. No one enters without my permission." "My lord," Finn said carefully, "if there is a conspiracy, then we will root it out. But she stays with me. The bond will not allow anything else." He stood, extended his hand toward Ren. She stared at it, at the claws that had not yet fully retracted, at the way his whole arm trembled with the effort of control. Slowly, terrified, she reached out and let him pull her to her feet. His hand engulfed hers, burning hot, and the bond between them pulsed like a heartbeat. "You are safe now," he said, and she did not know if he was trying to convince her or himself. "I will not let anyone hurt you again." But Ren, staring up into those blazing amber eyes, knew that safety was not something she had ever truly possessed, and she did not think she was about to start now. The mute oracle's daughter. The chamber they brought her to was larger than the entire kitchen where she had spent the last 7 years. Ren stood in the center of it, shaking, while servants she did not recognize laid a fire in the hearth and set fresh linens on a bed that could have slept 4 people. They did not look at her, these castle servants with their clean uniforms and steady hands, and she understood that she had crossed some invisible threshold, had moved from one world into another without any say in the matter. The King had not followed. He had handed her off to Finn with instructions she could barely hear over the roaring in her ears, and then he had disappeared back into his own chambers with Briar at his heels. The bond stretched between them, thin and golden and impossible to ignore, and Wren could feel him through it, even with walls separating them. His rage, barely leashed, his confusion, and underneath it all, something that felt like wonder, painful and desperate. When the servants finally left, closing the door behind them with a soft click, Wren sank onto the edge of the bed and pressed both hands to her chest where the bond seated itself. She could feel her heart hammering, could feel his heart as well, the rhythm not quite synchronized with her own. It was the most invasive thing she had ever experienced, worse than any beating, worse than the years of isolation, because there was no way to hide from it, no way to make herself small enough to escape notice. The door opened again. Wren jerked upright, expecting guards, but it was an old woman who entered, bent with age, her gray hair bound in a simple braid. She carried a basket over one arm, and her eyes, sharp green despite the wrinkle surrounding them, fixed on Wren with an expression that was not unkind. "Marjorie," the woman said, her voice rough as tree bark, "I tend the kitchen gardens, grow herbs. His Majesty has asked me to help you communicate." Wren stared. Old Marjorie, she knew the name, knew the woman by sight, though they had never spoken. Marjorie was the one who sometimes left bread wrapped in cloth near the scullery door, the one who had once given Wren a salve for burns without asking questions. Wren had thought her simply a kind old woman. Now, watching the way Marjorie moved, the deliberate grace, despite her apparent frailty, she wondered what else she had missed. Marjorie set the basket on the table, began pulling items from it. Parchment, a stick of charcoal, a small slate and chalk. "Can you write, child?" Wren hesitated, then nodded. A little. Her education had been minimal, interrupted by the massacre when she was 15, and 7 years of disuse had not helped. But she could manage basic words, if she went slowly. Good. Marjorie pushed the parchment and charcoal across the table. "Tell me what happened tonight. Everything." Wren's hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the charcoal. She pressed it to the parchment and began to write, her letters clumsy and uneven. "Brought food to King. Smelled wrong. Purple on meat. Stopped him." Marjorie leaned close, squinting at the words. "Purple? You saw poison?" Wren nodded. She did not know how she had known, only that the recognition had been instant, visceral. Marjorie's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Interesting, very interesting indeed. She straightened, pulled a chair close, and sat with a sigh. "Now, write this. 3 nights ago, what did you see in the gardens?" The charcoal snapped in Wren's grip. She stared at the old woman, her heart lurching, and Marjorie's expression did not change. "I know you were there, child. I know you saw Lady Verity meeting with hooded figures. I know, because I was there too, in the shadows, watching. Now write what you saw, before someone else asks less gently." Wren's hands moved almost without her conscious control. Lady Verity, hooded men, gave them something in velvet bag, talked low, could not hear words. Marjorie took the parchment, read it, and her mouth pressed into a grim line. When she looked up again, her expression was harder. "Child, I am going to tell you things that may frighten you, but you must know them if you are to survive what comes next. Do you understand?" Wren nodded, though she did not understand, could not imagine what could be more frightening than the bond thrumming in her chest, the king's emotions bleeding into hers. Marjorie stood, moved to the door, and pressed her ear against it, listening. When she seemed satisfied, she returned and spoke quietly. "This kingdom is not what it appears. The king and his court, they are not entirely human. They are wolves, shifters, creatures of old magic that most humans have forgotten." Wren blinked. She should have been shocked, should have been disbelieving, but instead she felt something click into place, a piece of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling. The king's eyes, his claws, the way the air had seemed to ripple around him. Of course. "You do not seem surprised," Marjorie observed. "Perhaps, somewhere deep, you already knew. The wolves who destroyed your village 7 years ago were not rogues, child. They were soldiers, and the people who commanded them wanted your entire bloodline erased." Wren's breath caught. She grabbed for the charcoal, scrawled frantically. "Why? What bloodline?" Marjorie's hand covered hers, stilling it. "Your mother was named Isla Ashcroft. She was Oracle Wolf, born with the gift of foresight, the ability to sense poison and lies and treachery. She served as advisor to King Torsten's father. When the old king died and Torsten took the throne, your mother continued to serve. She was his protection against conspiracy." The room felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. Wren shook her head, but Marjorie continued relentlessly. "7 years ago, your mother began having prophetic dreams. She saw betrayal, saw someone close to the throne planning murder. She was going to testify before the council, going to name the traitor. And 2 days before she could speak, your village burned." Wren's hands were pressed flat against the table, the charcoal rolling away forgotten. She could not breathe, could not think. Marjorie's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You were 15. Old enough."
"To have inherited the gift, that made you dangerous. But you were also young, traumatized. Someone decided you could be controlled instead of killed. Your voice was bound with a curse, your memories suppressed, and you were placed in the kitchens where you could be watched." "No," Wren wanted to say. "No, that cannot be true." But her throat was closed, had always been closed, and the silence swallowed her protest. The door opened without warning. Both women flinched, and Finn Greywater stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral. He looked at Marjorie, at Wren, at the parchment on the table. "His Majesty wishes to speak with the girl." "She cannot speak with him," Marjorie said sharply. "She needs time to—" "Now," Finn interrupted, and his voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. "There has been a development." Wren stood on shaking legs. Marjorie gripped her arm, leaned close. "You are stronger than you know, child. Remember that." Then Finn was guiding her through a connecting door into a room that was all dark wood and weapons mounted on walls, and the king standing by the fire, his back to them. He had changed clothes, wore simple leather now instead of the jerkin from before, and his silver hair hung loose down his back. When he turned, his eyes were still faintly glowing, still more amber than any human color. "Master Dunley is dead," he said without preamble. "His body was found in the river an hour ago, officially an accident, but the marks on his throat suggest strangulation." Wren's knees went weak. Finn caught her elbow, steadied her. The king's gaze fixed on her face. "You delivered the poisoned food. Dunley gave you the tray. Someone wanted to ensure the chain of evidence ended with people who could not testify." He gestured to the table where more parchment waited. "I need to know everything you saw, everything you heard, in your own words." Wren crossed to the table, sat, picked up the charcoal. Her hands were steadier now, shock giving way to something harder. She wrote for a long time, covering 3 sheets of parchment with her cramped, uneven script. The meeting in the garden, Lady Verity's punishment 3 days later, the way Dunley had seemed nervous when he gave her the tray, the bitter smell she had recognized without knowing how. The king read in silence, Finn standing at his shoulder. When they finished, they looked at each other, and some communication passed between them that Wren could not interpret. "It is as we suspected," Finn said quietly. "Verity has been planning this for years." "Since before the Ashcraft massacre," the king agreed. His jaw was clenched, so tight Wren could see the muscle jumping. "She brought the girl here herself, claimed to be rescuing survivors, placed her in the kitchens where she could monitor her." He looked at Wren, and his expression was devastating. "You have been a prisoner in my own castle for 7 years, and I did not know, did not see." Wren wanted to tell him it was not his fault, that she had been invisible by design, but she had no voice, and the words would not come.
She simply sat there, the charcoal limp in her hand, and felt the bond between them pulse with his guilt. Finn cleared his throat. "My lord, we cannot arrest Lady Verity without proof. She is High Steward, the king's cousin, and she has allies in 4 Pack territories. If we move against her without evidence, we risk civil war." "Then we gather evidence," the king said. "We watch her. We trace her network, and when we have what we need, we strike." He turned to Ren. "You will stay close to me, serve as my personal attendant. It will give you protection and give us reason to keep you near. It will also make her a target," Finn said. The king's eyes flashed. "Let them try. Anyone who touches her will learn what it means to threaten a king's mate." The word hung in the air. Mate. Ren looked up, met his gaze, and saw the truth of it burning there. This was not a choice, not a courtship. This was fate, written into their very bones. She was bound to him now, for better or worse, and there was no undoing it. Finn bowed and left. The king crossed to where Ren sat, moved slowly, carefully, as though approaching something wild and wounded. He knelt, bringing his eyes level with hers. "I know this is not what you wanted. I know you are afraid. But I swear to you, I will find who did this. I will make them pay for every day you have suffered, and I will find a way to give you back your voice." Ren stared at him. The bond showed her his sincerity, his rage on her behalf, his desperate need to fix what had been broken. She reached for the parchment, wrote slowly, "You found me when I needed you most. That is enough." His hand came up, hesitated, then very gently touched her face. His palm was fever-hot, and she shivered. "Not enough," he murmured. "Not nearly enough. But it is a start." The king's shadow. Over the 7 days that followed, Ren learned what it meant to live in the light instead of shadow, and she was not certain which was more terrifying. The first morning, she woke in the vast bed with its soft linens and did not know where she was. Panic seized her, the old instinct to make herself small and invisible, and she was halfway to the floor before she remembered. The king, the bond, the poison, everything had changed in a single night, and she was no longer the mute scullery maid who counted days in the darkness. A servant brought breakfast on a silver tray, bread that was still warm, and fruit that had not begun to bruise, and cheese that did not taste of mold. Ren stared at it, unable to reconcile this abundance with the years of scraps and burned porridge. She ate slowly, waiting for someone to snatch it away, to tell her she had no right to such things. No one came. By mid-morning, Finn arrived to escort her to the king's chambers. "You will bring his meals, tend his rooms, and remain within sight during the day," he explained. "At night, you return to your own chamber with guards posted. His Majesty wants you safe, but he also wants to avoid impropriety." Ren nodded, though she suspected impropriety was the least of anyone's concerns. When they entered the king's rooms, he was standing at a table covered in maps and parchment, his hair tied back, his expression distant. He looked up when they entered, and his eyes found Ren immediately, that amber gaze cataloging her as though confirming she was real, unharmed. "Bring the correspondence from the Eastern Territory," he said to Finn, then looked at Ren. "There is tea by the fire. Pour for both of us." It was a simple command, domestic, and Ren moved to obey. Her hands shook only slightly, and when she brought him the cup, he took it without comment. But she felt his attention on her, constant and assessing, as though he was trying to solve a puzzle he did not have all the pieces for. The second day, he noticed her flinching. Ren had not realized she was doing it. The automatic response whenever he moved too quickly or raised his voice. But when his hand came up to point at something on a map and she jerked backward, he stopped mid-gesture. His expression went very still. He dismissed Finn, waited until the door closed, then turned to her. "I am going to reach for the water pitcher," he said, his voice deliberately even. "I am not reaching for you. Watch, He moved with exaggerated slowness, picked up the pitcher, poured water into a cup. I am walking to the window. I am sitting in this chair. You see? Wren nodded, her face burning with shame. She had not meant to show fear, had not wanted him to see how deeply the years of abuse had carved themselves into her reflexes. But the bond betrayed her, let him feel what she could not hide, and his jaw clenched with something that looked like pain. "I will not hurt you," he said quietly. "I know you do not believe that yet, but I will prove it, however long it takes." By the 4th day, Wren had begun to anticipate his needs without being asked. When he frowned at a letter, she brought him tea. When his shoulders tensed with frustration, she lit extra candles so he could read more easily. He noticed, she could tell, the way his eyes followed her movements, the way his expression softened fractionally when she set things within his reach before he had to ask. That evening, as she was preparing to leave for her own chambers, he spoke without looking up from his work. "You understand me. Even without words, you see what I need." Wren hesitated, then crossed to the table, picked up a piece of parchment and charcoal. "I watch people. It is how I survived." He read it, and something in his face cracked open. "You should not have had to survive in my own castle. You should have been protected." She wrote, "I am still here. That is enough." "It is not," he said, and his voice was rough. "It will never be enough." The 5th night, Wren woke screaming. No sound emerged, of course, but her body convulsed with the silent scream, her throat raw with the effort of pushing air through the curse that bound her voice. She was back in Ashcroft, back in the fire and smoke, watching her mother fall, watching the wolves tear through the village. She could smell burning flesh, could hear the wet sounds of death, and she thrashed against the blankets as though they were hands holding her down. The door to her chamber slammed open, guards burst in, swords drawn, and then the king was there, shoving past them, still in his sleeping clothes, with his hair loose around his shoulders. He took one look at Wren and turned to the guards. "Out, now." They left. The king did not approach the bed. He simply lowered himself to the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes on her face. "You are safe," he said, and his voice was steady, anchoring. "I am here. Nothing will hurt you. Breathe with me. In, out." Wren focused on his voice, on the rhythm he was setting, and slowly, so slowly, her breathing evened. The nightmare receded, leaving her shaking and soaked in sweat. The king did not move from his position on the floor. He stayed there all night, a silent guardian, and eventually Wren slept again with his presence as her anchor. In the morning, she found a note slipped under her door. His handwriting, bold and slanted. "You are not alone anymore." The 6th day brought the summons they had been dreading. A messenger arrived with a formal request from the Council of Territories. The king was required to attend the seasonal gathering in 3 days. Refusal would be seen as weakness, an admission that something was wrong in the Northern Territory. Finn laid out the political ramifications while the king listened, his expression growing darker. "If I go, I leave her vulnerable," he said finally. "Verity is here. She will see an opportunity." "Then bring the girl with you," Finn suggested. "She is your personal attendant now. It would not be questioned." The king looked at Wren. She was standing by the window, and she turned to meet his gaze. The bond between them pulsed with his concern, his reluctance to put her in danger. But she understood the necessity. She crossed to the table, wrote quickly, "Safer with you than here with her." He read it, and something in his face shifted. "Very well. You come with me. But you stay close, you stay armed, and if anything feels wrong, you find me immediately." He looked at Finn. "Arrange it." The 7th day was spent in preparation. Captain Breyer arrived, tall and scarred and utterly intimidating, and announced she would be teaching Wren to defend herself. "The king wants you able to survive if you are separated from him," she said bluntly. I have 4 hours. Pay attention." She taught Ren how to break a hold, how to strike vulnerable points, how to run when running was the better option. Ren was clumsy, weak from years of poor food and hard labor, but Briar was patient in a way that surprised her. "You are small," the captain said. "Use it. Be underestimated. Then strike." That evening, Ren found herself alone with the king for the first time since the bond had formed. He was at his desk, reading letters, and she was mending a tear in one of his shirts because she did not know what else to do with her hands. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer frightening, and when he finally set down his quill and looked at her, his expression was soft. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before we leave tomorrow. Something you should know about me." Ren set aside the mending, gave him her full attention. He stood, moved to the fire, stared into the flames. "For 10 years after I took the throne, I waited for the mate bond to form. It is rare for an alpha to reach 30 without finding their mate, and I had begun to believe I was broken somehow, cursed. I was planning to take a political mate to secure alliances through marriage because I did not think you existed." He turned to face her. "And then you walked into my chambers with poison meant to kill me, and the bond snapped into place like a blade through my chest, and I realized you had been here all along, suffering under my own roof, while I was too blind to see." Ren stood, crossed to him, pulled out the piece of parchment she now kept always in her pocket. She wrote, "You could not have known. I was made invisible." "I should have known," he said. "A king should know every person in his castle, should protect the vulnerable, and I failed you." She wrote again, pressing the charcoal hard against the paper. "You found me when I needed you most. Stop punishing yourself for the past and help me survive the future." He read it, and a rough laugh escaped him. "You are wiser than I am." She shook her head, wrote, "I am practical. There is a difference." He reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, his hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be what you need when I can barely control the wolf. The bond makes me want to lock you away, keep you safe, never let you out of my sight. It is not rational." She leaned into his palm, felt the heat of him, the barely leashed power. Then she picked up the parchment again. "I do not need rational. I need honest." "Honest," he repeated. "Then, honestly, you terrify me. The thought of losing you, of failing to protect you, it makes me feral, and I do not know if I can control that." Ren took his other hand, placed it over her heart where the bond seated itself. She looked up at him, held his gaze, and mouthed carefully, "Then we learn together." Something in his expression broke open. He pulled her close, not roughly, but with desperate care, and pressed his forehead to hers. The bond flared between them, gold and burning, and for a moment they simply breathed together, two people trying to figure out how to carry the weight of fate. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "we ride for the council grounds. It will be dangerous. There will be alphas who see you as weakness, as leverage. You must promise me you will be careful." Ren nodded against his shoulder. He held her a moment longer, then released her, stepped back, put distance between them, as though proximity was dangerous. "Sleep," he said. "We leave at dawn." That night, Ren lay in her bed and did not count days. Instead, she thought about the king's hands, about Briar's lessons, about the fact that she was no longer just surviving, but actively choosing to fight. It was terrifying. It was also the first time in 7 years that she had felt even remotely alive. The Council of Wolves. The journey to the council grounds took 3 days through winter forest that seemed to close in tighter with each mile. Ren rode beside the king on a gray mare that Finn had chosen for her gentleness, and though her body ached from disuse and her hands blistered on the reins, she did not complain. Complaint required a voice she did not have. The king watched her constantly. She could feel his attention even when she was not looking at him, could feel his concern through the bond whenever she shifted in the saddle or her face tightened with discomfort. On the second night, when they camped in a clearing and she nearly fell dismounting, his hands caught her waist, steadying her, and his voice was low in her ear. "You should have told me you were hurting." She turned, met his eyes, and gestured helplessly. How? He understood. His jaw clenched, and he lifted her down the rest of the way as though she weighed nothing. That night, he taught her hand signs that Finn had been using with scouts for years. Simple gestures for pain, danger, stop, help. She practiced them by the fire until her fingers remembered the shapes, and when she signed thank you, his expression softened in a way that the bond pulsed warm between them. They reached the council grounds on the third afternoon. The ancient stone amphitheater rose from the forest floor like the bones of some long-dead giant. 7 tiers of seating surrounding a central floor where the alphas would meet. Tents and pavilions had been erected around the perimeter, each flying the colors of different territories, and the air was thick with the scent of wolves and wood smoke and tension. Wren dismounted, her legs shaking, and immediately felt the weight of attention shift toward her. Alphas and their entourages turned to stare at the king's party, and their eyes caught on her, the small human girl in travel-stained clothes riding at the northern king's side. She heard whispers, felt the assessment in their gazes, and instinctively moved closer to the king's horse. His hand came down, rested briefly on her shoulder. "Stay close to Finn," he murmured. "Do not wander. Do not trust anyone." She nodded, and he rode toward the largest pavilion where the other alphas were gathering. Finn helped Wren down, his expression carefully neutral, and guided her toward a smaller tent that had been prepared for the king's personal staff. Inside, servants were already unpacking, and Captain Briar stood near the entrance, her hand on her sword hilt, her scarred face set in grim lines. "The politics here are poison," Briar said quietly to Finn. "Half these alphas want Torsten dead so they can divide his territory. The other half want him weak enough to manipulate. And now he has brought an unmated human girl as personal attendant." "She is not unmated," Finn corrected. "She is his mate. The bond formed 8 days ago." Briar's eyes widened fractionally. Then this just became infinitely more dangerous. If his enemies realize what she is, they will try to take her, Finn finished. "I know, so we do not let her out of our sight." Wren stood very still, absorbing this, and felt fear curl cold in her stomach. She had known the council would be dangerous, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it real in a way that twisted the bond tight with anxiety. Somewhere across the grounds, the king felt it, and she sensed his answering surge of protective fury before he forced it down, forced himself to focus on the political theater he was required to perform. That evening, there was a formal feast in the amphitheater. Wren served wine, moving between the long tables where alphas and their lunas sat in carefully arranged hierarchies. She kept her eyes down, made herself invisible the way she had learned in the kitchens, and listened. "The Northern King has been unwed too long," one alpha was saying, his voice carrying over the noise. "It shows weakness, instability." "Perhaps he is waiting for a proper alliance," a Luna responded. Her tone was sharp, political. "My daughter is of age. A union between our territories would benefit both." Lady Verity was seated 3 tables away, and Wren felt her gaze like a blade against her skin. The High Steward had arrived a day early, had already been working the crowd, and now she leaned toward the alpha beside her, speaking too quietly for Wren to hear. But she saw the way the man's eyes flicked toward the king, toward Wren herself, and something predatory entered his expression. Wren moved on, refilling cups, and nearly collided with another servant. She stepped back, murmured an apology that made no sound, and the servant gave her a strange look before moving away. It was only later, when she was returning to the king's pavilion, that she realized she had been near the tent belonging to Alpha Ragnar Steelmaw, the man Lady Verity had been speaking with. And she had overheard, just for a moment, a fragment of conversation drifting through the canvas walls. "Once he is dead," a voice was saying, "the Northern Territory falls to you as nearest blood relation." Wren froze. She knew that voice. Lady Verity. And the man responding was Ragnar, his tone satisfied, conspiratorial. "The girl is the weak point. If we can remove her, he will be unstable enough to challenge. Grief makes alphas reckless." Wren's heart hammered. She needed to tell someone, needed to warn the king, but there were guards everywhere, and moving too quickly would draw attention. She forced herself to walk calmly, to carry her empty wine flagon as though she had every right to be there. And when she finally reached Finn, she grabbed his wrist and pulled him aside. He frowned at her urgency, then understanding dawned. "You heard something?" She nodded frantically, pulled out parchment and charcoal from her pocket, wrote quickly, "Verity and Steelmaw, planning King's death, said I am weak point. Remove me and he is unstable." Finn read it, his face going hard. "Where?" She pointed toward Ragnar's tent. Finn looked at Briar, who had appeared at his shoulder. "Get her to the king, now. I will investigate." They moved through the camp quickly, Briar's hand on Wren's elbow, and when they reached the king's pavilion, he was alone, studying maps by lamplight. He looked up, saw Wren's face, and was across the room in 3 strides. "What happened?" Briar handed him the parchment. His eyes scanned it, and the temperature in the tent seemed to drop. His hands clenched, crumpling the paper, and Wren felt his rage through the bond like wildfire. When he looked at her again, his eyes were glowing faintly, the wolf too close to the surface. "You are not leaving my sight again," he said, and his voice was barely human. "Not for a moment. Do you understand?" Wren nodded, but fear was curling tighter in her chest. If they knew she had overheard, if they realized she had warned the king, they would move faster. She reached for more parchment, wrote, "They will try tonight, before you can prepare." The king read it, then called for Finn and Briar. When they entered, he outlined the situation in clipped sentences. "We increase the guard. No one enters this tent without being identified. Wren stays armed." Briar pulled a dagger from her belt, handed it to Wren. "If anyone comes for you, go for the throat or the belly. Do not hesitate." The blade was heavier than Wren expected, cold in her palm. She tucked it into her belt, felt its weight against her hip, and wondered if she would actually be able to use it when the moment came. They did not have to wait long. Near midnight, when the camp had gone quiet and most of the alphas had retired to their tents, Wren woke to the sound of footsteps outside. She was on a pallet near the king's sleeping area, Finn on watch by the entrance, and she saw him tense, saw his hand go to his sword. The tent flap opened. 2 guards entered, men Wren recognized from Ragnar's retinue, and behind them was Lady Verity herself, her pale eyes fixed on Wren with cold satisfaction. "The king is summoned to an emergency council session," Verity said smoothly. "There has been an accusation of treaty violation. He must answer immediately." Finn did not move. At midnight, without formal notice? I think not. Verity's smile was sharp. "Then perhaps we should discuss why his personal servant was seen near Alpha Ragnar's tent earlier this evening, listening to private conversations, spying." The king emerged from the sleeping area, already dressed, his hair loose, and his eyes blazing amber. "Wren is under my protection. If you have accusations, make them to me directly." Verity's composure did not slip, but Wren saw the flash of calculation in her eyes. She had expected the king to be alone, vulnerable. Finding him alert and armed had disrupted her plan, but she was adapting quickly. "Very well, Your Majesty. Then let us speak plainly. Your mute servant has been seen in places she should not be. She delivered poisoned food to your chambers 8 days ago. She was found near Alpha Ragnar's tent tonight. These are not coincidences." The king took a step forward, and the air around him shimmered with heat. "Are you accusing my mate of conspiracy against me?" The word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Verity's eyes widened fractionally, the first crack in her facade. "Your mate?" "The bond formed the night she saved my life," the king said, and his voice was deadly quiet. "She stopped me from eating the poison that you arranged to have delivered. And now you dare to stand in my tent and accuse her of treachery?" Verity recovered quickly, but Wren saw the fear beneath her composure now. If the bond has formed, then perhaps the girl has used magic to manufacture it. Oracle wolves were known to have such abilities. Finn laughed, the sound harsh. "You just confirmed you know what she is. How would you know she is Oracle-born unless you were involved in the massacre that was supposed to eliminate her bloodline?" The guards behind Verity shifted nervously. Verity herself had gone very still, and Wren realized they had pushed too hard, revealed too much. The High Steward's hand moved toward her belt, toward something hidden there, and Wren saw the glint of a vial. She moved without thinking, crossed the space between them, knocked the vial from Verity's hand before she could uncork it. The glass shattered on the floor, and whatever poison it contained hissed and smoked against the canvas. Verity's mask finally cracked. She grabbed Wren, pulled her close with one arm around her throat, a knife appearing in her other hand. The guards drew swords, chaos erupted, and the king's roar shook the tent poles. But Verity was already moving, dragging Wren backward through a slit in the tent that had been pre-cut, an escape route. Wren struggled, tried to use Briar's training, but Verity was stronger, and the knife at her throat kept her still. They emerged into the darkness behind the tents. Horses waited there, and more guards, and Ragnar Steelmaw himself. He smiled when he saw them, the king's little pet, perfect. Wren was thrown onto a horse, her hands bound, a gag tied across her mouth, though it was unnecessary. She tried to scream down the bond, tried to send everything she was feeling to the king, and she felt his answering fury, felt him coming. But Verity was already spurring her horse forward, and they were riding into the forest, and Wren knew that by the time the king reached them, she would be far beyond saving. The forest became a blur of darkness and branches that tore at Wren's clothes as they rode. She was thrown across the saddle in front of one of Verity's guards, his arm locked around her waist, and every jolt sent pain lancing through her ribs. The gag cut into the corners of her mouth, and her bound hands had gone numb. But none of that mattered compared to the golden thread stretching thinner and thinner between her chest and the king's, pulling taut like a wire. She could feel him. Even at this distance, even through the terror flooding her system, she could feel his rage, his desperation, the wolf rising to consume the man. He was coming. But Verity had planned well, had horses waiting, had a route mapped through terrain that would slow pursuit, and with every mile they put between themselves, the bond grew fainter, the connection harder to hold. They rode for hours. When they finally stopped to rest the horses, Wren was dragged down and thrown against a tree. Her legs would not hold her, and she collapsed into the frozen leaves, gasping through the gag. Verity dismounted gracefully, approached with that same cold composure she had always worn, and crouched down to Wren's level. "Do you know how much I paid for the curse that bound your voice?" she asked conversationally, as though they were discussing the weather. "A fortune, but it was worth every coin. The witch who performed it told me it would tighten with trauma, that the more you remembered, the more it would choke you. By now, I imagine trying to speak feels like swallowing glass." She reached out, pulled the gag down, and Wren sucked in air through her raw throat. Verity smiled. "Scream if you want. Go ahead. No one will hear you out here. Oh wait, you cannot scream at all, can you? That curse was the best investment I ever made." Wren stared at her with all the hatred she could not voice, and Verity's smile widened. "The witch is dead, of course. I cannot leave loose ends. just as your mother was a loose end, just as your entire village was a loose end, just as you should have been. But I thought you were so thoroughly broken, so completely silenced, that you might actually be useful. A mute servant sees everything, reports nothing. I have been using you to monitor the kitchens for years, making sure no one else tried to poison the king before I was ready. She stood, brushed dirt from her skirts. But then you had to ruin everything by being his mate, by triggering the bond. And now you are a liability I can no longer afford. Ragnar appeared, leading his horse. Are we killing her now or waiting until we reach Greystone? Verity considered. Greystone. She is worth more as leverage until we know whether the king survived your men's ambush at the council grounds. If he lives, we ransom her. If he dies, we eliminate her and claim I rescued her from your kidnapping. Either way, I win. They replaced Wren's gag, hauled her back onto a horse, and the nightmare continued. The forest gave way to hills, then to rocky terrain that Wren did not recognize. Her whole body ached, her wrists were bleeding where the ropes cut into them, and the bond had faded to the faintest whisper, so thin she thought it might already be broken. She tried to send something down it anyway, not emotion this time, but images. The mountains she could see to the north, the shape of them against the stars, the direction they were traveling, anything that might help him find her, if he was still alive, if he was still looking. She did not know if he received it. The bond gave nothing back but silence. They reached Greystone Fortress as dawn was breaking. The structure rose from the mountainside like something carved from the bones of the earth itself, all gray stone and narrow windows and walls that would be impossible to scale. Wren was dragged from the horse, pulled through a gate and up endless stairs, and finally thrown into a cell at the top of a tower. Wren. The door slammed shut, the lock turned, and Wren was alone. She crawled to the narrow window, pulled herself up to look out. The mountains stretched in every direction, and somewhere beyond them was the king, if he lived. She pressed her hand to her chest where the bond seated itself, closed her eyes, and tried to feel him. There, faint, so faint, but there, a flicker of something that might have been his heartbeat or might have been her imagination. She was still alive. He was still alive. That had to be enough. The day passed in silence, broken only by the sound of guards outside her door. No one brought food or water. Wren did not expect them to. She was a hostage, not a guest, and keeping her weak made sense. She spent the time trying to work the ropes on her wrists against a rough stone protruding from the wall. But they were well tied, and all she managed was to make the bleeding worse. As the sun set, she heard voices below. Verity had arrived, and she was arguing with Ragnar, their voices carrying up through the tower's stone shaft. I told you to kill her quietly, Verity was saying. A fall from the cliffs, an accident, not this. She is worth a kingdom as ransom, Ragnar countered. The king will give me anything for her return. Territory, gold, his own throat if I demand it. You are a fool. Oracle wolves remember everything eventually. The longer she lives, the more dangerous she becomes. Then we extract what leverage we can and dispose of her before she becomes a problem. Wren pressed her back against the wall, her heart hammering. She had perhaps a day, maybe less, before they decided she was more trouble than she was worth. She needed to escape, needed to find a way out. But the door was solid oak, and the window was a sheer drop to rocks below. She thought of Briar's lessons. Be underestimated, then strike. She looked around the cell with new eyes. There was nothing, no furniture, no tools, but the stones themselves were old, and in the corner, one had worked partially loose. She crawled to it, began prying at it with her bound hands, and after what felt like hours, it finally came free. It was small, the size of a fist, but it was heavy and solid, and it was a weapon. She hid it in her skirts and waited. Night fell. Wren dozed fitfully, her body too exhausted to remain fully alert, and when she woke, it was to the sound of the lock turning. She sat up, her hand closing around the stone hidden beside her, and the door opened to reveal Ragnar Steelmaw. He was alone, which was either arrogance or stupidity. He looked at her with the kind of calculating hunger that made her skin crawl. "The king has not responded to our ransom demand," he said, "which means either he is dead or he does not care enough to negotiate. Either way, you have outlived your usefulness." He moved toward her, and Ren did not hesitate. She swung the stone with all the strength she had, caught him across the temple, and he went down hard. She scrambled over him, her hand still bound, and ran. The tower stairs spiraled down into darkness. Ren took them as fast as she dared, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bond stretched so thin she could barely feel it anymore. Behind her, she heard Ragnar shouting, heard guards responding, and the hunt was on. She reached the ground level, burst through a door into what looked like a great hall, and skidded to a stop. Lady Verity stood there, surrounded by her own guards, and her expression was coldly furious. Going somewhere? Ren tried to run, but hands caught her, dragged her back. Verity approached, pulled a dagger from her belt, and pressed it to Ren's throat. "I should have done this 7 years ago. I should have killed you in your bed the night of the massacre, instead of binding your voice and thinking you could be controlled." The blade bit into skin. Ren felt blood, hot and wet, trickling down her neck. And in that moment, with death a heartbeat away and nothing left to lose, something inside her cracked. The curse had been built on trauma and isolation, on the belief that she was alone and powerless. But she was not alone. She could feel the king through the bond, distant but real, and she knew with absolute certainty that he was coming. And she was not powerless. She had survived 7 years of abuse, had saved the king's life, had fought back when Verity tried to poison him. She was oracle-born, daughter of a seer, and she had a voice, even if she had forgotten how to use it. The curse fractured. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough. Ren opened her mouth, and for the first time in 7 years, sound emerged. It was barely a whisper, raw and broken and agonizing, but it was there. "Your soldiers should know," she forced out, each word like glass in her throat. "You poisoned the Southern Alpha's entire family last winter." Everyone froze. Ragnar, who had descended from the tower, stared at her. "What?" Ren's eyes were watering from the pain, but she kept going. "I saw the letters. She killed them, blamed it on plague, so you could take their territory." As she spoke, something else happened. Her eyes began to glow, a soft golden light that had nothing to do with the lamps, and everyone in the hall could feel it, the truth of her words resonating in their bones. This was the oracle gift fully manifesting, the ability to speak truth that could not be denied. Ragnar turned to Verity. His face had gone dark. "Is this true?" Verity's composure finally shattered. Her hand tightened on the knife at Ren's throat. "She is lying. Oracle magic is just manipulation." But Ragnar's soldiers were looking at each other, doubt spreading through their ranks. And in that moment of chaos, the wall of the great hall exploded inward. Stone and mortar blasted across the floor as an enormous silver-white wolf crashed through, larger than any wolf should be, its eyes blazing pure amber. Behind it came 50 more, a wave of fur and fangs and fury. And at the center of it all was the king. He had found her, and he had brought his wrath with him. Verity's knife fell away from Ren's throat as the woman stumbled backward. The king shifted mid-stride, becoming human again, and his voice was not human at all when he spoke. "Release her. Now." Ren felt the bond slam back into full force, no longer thin and stretched, but burning bright and unbreakable. She met his eyes across the chaos, and the relief in his expression was devastating. Then the fighting began, and Ren knew that whatever came next, she would face it not in silence, but with her voice, finally, painfully, her own, the oracle's scream. The great hall erupted into chaos. Ragnar's soldiers drew weapons, the king's wolves surged forward, and in the center of it all, Ren stood, with blood trickling down her throat and her voice still raw from speaking for the first time in 7 years. The guard holding her had released his grip when the wall exploded, and she stumbled forward, her bound hands making balance impossible. Captain Briar was suddenly there, catching her, a blade flashing as she cut the ropes around Ren's wrists. "Stay behind me," the captain commanded, but Ren could barely hear her over the sound of snarling and steel clashing against claws. The king was a force of nature. He moved through Ragnar's soldiers like a storm, not bothering to shift fully, fighting in that terrible in-between state where he was neither man nor wolf, but something more dangerous than both. His claws tore through leather and flesh, his strength sent grown men flying, and his eyes never stopped tracking Ren's position, making sure she was safe even as he carved a path of destruction toward her. Finn appeared at the king's side, fully shifted, a massive brown wolf with Ren's scent in his nose, and together they drove toward where Lady Verity was attempting to flee through a side door. The High Steward's composure had finally shattered completely, her pale face twisted with fear and fury, and she was screaming orders that no one was following, because half of Ragnar's forces had turned on the other half, the seeds of doubt Ren had planted now bearing violent fruit. The king reached Verity before she made it to the door. His hand closed around her arm, yanked her back, and she spun with a dagger already in her grip. She struck fast, aiming for his throat, but he caught her wrist, twisted, and the blade clattered to the floor. His other hand closed around her throat, lifted her until her feet left the ground, and his voice was barely recognizable. "You put your hands on my mate. You tried to kill her. Give me one reason I should not end you where you stand." Verity clawed at his grip, gasping, "You cannot. I am High Steward. The council will never forgive regicide." "You are a traitor and a murderer," the king snarled. "Wait." Ren's voice cut through the noise, ragged and painful, but audible. He stopped, his head turning toward her, and she forced herself to cross the distance between them, even though her legs were shaking. "Do not kill her. Not yet." His eyes, still blazing amber, fixed on her face. "She tried to have you murdered. She kept you enslaved for 7 years. She deserves death." "She deserves justice," Ren corrected, each word an effort. "And there are things she knows. About the conspiracy. About who else was involved. We need her alive to expose them all." The king's hand tightened fractionally, and Verity made a choking sound. Then, through gritted teeth, he said, "You are more merciful than I am." He dropped Verity, and she collapsed to the floor, coughing. To the guards who had fought for him, he commanded, "Chain her, Silver. She does not leave your sight." Ragnar Steelmaw had been backed into a corner by 3 of the king's wolves, and when he saw Verity taken into custody, something in him broke. He shifted, a massive gray wolf with scarred flanks, and tried to fight his way out. But Finn was faster, tackling him mid-leap, and the 2 alphas went down in a snarling tangle of fur and teeth. The fight was brutal and short. Finn was the king's second for a reason, and when it ended, Ragnar was on his back, with Finn's jaws locked around his throat. The gray wolf went still, the ultimate gesture of submission, and slowly, Finn released him. Naked and bleeding, he did not try to stand. "I yield," he rasped, "to the Northern King. My territory, my soldiers, my life, all of it. Just let me live." The king looked at him with disgust. "You conspired to murder your king and divide the territories into civil war. You kidnapped and intended to kill my mate, and now you beg for mercy." "I was manipulated," Ragnar said quickly, desperately. "Lady Verity promised me power, promised me that you were weak, that the territories would be better served with new leadership. I was a fool, but I was not the architect. She was." "Coward," Verity spat from where she knelt in chains. "You were eager enough when you thought we would win." The king turned away from both of them, crossed to where Ren stood with Briar. and his hands came up to frame her face with a gentleness that belied the violence he had just enacted. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, his eyes searching hers. "Are you hurt?" Ren tried to speak, managed only, "Throat. Hurts." His expression cracked with anguish. "You spoke. The curse broke." "Had to," she whispered. "Had to warn them. About her. You nearly died. The bond was so thin I thought I had lost you." His forehead pressed against hers, and she felt him shaking. "Do not ever do that to me again." She wanted to promise, but honesty was all she had left. "Cannot promise that. Too much at stake." He made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her close, careful of her injuries. "You terrify me." "Good," she whispered against his shoulder. "Means you care." Around them, the fighting had stopped. Ragnar's soldiers who had not been killed were surrendering, kneeling with their throats bared. The king's forces moved through the hall, securing prisoners. And Finn shifted back to human, accepting a cloak from one of the guards. "It is done, my lord. Greystone is yours." The king did not release Ren. "Not the fortress. I want confessions from everyone involved. Every name, every territory, every piece of this conspiracy exposed." Finn nodded. "What of Lady Verity?" "Public trial," the king said, "at the council grounds. Let every alpha see what happens to traitors." Verity laughed, the sound bitter. "You think a trial will save your reputation? Half the council already questions your fitness to rule. An unmated king," they whispered, "unstable. And now you have bonded with a mute servant girl? They will never accept her as queen." The king turned slowly, his eyes locking on Verity. "She is not mute anymore. And she is oracle-born, the last of a bloodline your conspiracy tried to eliminate. She will be queen, and royal oracle both, and any alpha who questions her fitness will answer to me personally." Ren felt the weight of that declaration settle onto her shoulders. She had gone from invisible scullery maid to the king's mate to future queen in the space of 10 days, and she had no idea how to be any of those things. But when the king's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together, the bond between them pulsed with certainty. "We should move her," Briar said quietly. "She needs a healer. That wound on her throat." "It can wait," Ren said, her voice barely above a whisper, but stubborn. "There is something I need to do first." She pulled away from the king, ignoring his protest, and walked to where Verity knelt in chains. The woman looked up at her, and for the first time, Ren saw real fear in those pale eyes. Ren crouched down, meeting her gaze at eye level, and when she spoke, her voice was raw but steady. "You tried to break me. You took my voice, my memories, my family, my life. You made me believe I was nothing, that I deserved the suffering." Verity said nothing, but her jaw was clenched tight. Ren continued, "You were wrong. I was never nothing. I was just waiting. And now I am going to stand in front of the council and I am going to tell them everything you did, in my own voice, with the oracle gift ensuring they know it is truth. And you are going to spend the rest of your life knowing that the girl you tried to erase was the one who destroyed you." She stood, swayed slightly, and the king was there immediately, his arm around her waist. Ren looked up at him. "Now I need a healer." He lifted her without asking permission, cradled her against his chest as though she weighed nothing, and carried her from the great hall. Behind them, Finn began organizing the prisoners, and Briar started cataloging evidence, and the machinery of justice began its work. But Ren heard none of it. She pressed her face into the king's shoulder, felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and let herself, for the first time in 7 years, believe that she might actually be safe. "You found your voice," he murmured, as he carried her up a tower stairway toward rooms that had been cleared and secured. "I did not think the curse could be broken." "Had to," she whispered, "could not let her win." You never let anyone win. It is one of the things He stopped himself, but Ren felt what he had almost said through the bond. Love. He had almost said love. She tilted her head back to look at him. Say it. His eyes met hers, amber and intense. I love you. I have loved you since the moment the bond snapped into place and I realized fate had given me someone worth protecting, worth fighting for. Ren's throat was too damaged for the words she wanted to say, so she simply pressed her hand over his heart and let the bond speak for her. Everything she felt, the gratitude and hope, and the beginnings of something that might, with time, become love in return. He understood. He always understood. And when he laid her down on a bed in a room that had been hastily prepared, when old Marjorie arrived with herbs and bandages, he did not leave. He sat beside her, holding her hand, and stayed while the healer worked. You will have scars, Marjorie said, as she cleaned the knife wound on Ren's throat, but your voice will strengthen with time and use. Good, Ren whispered. I have a lot to say. The king's hand tightened on hers. Then, I will spend the rest of my life listening. And despite everything, despite the pain and exhaustion and the knowledge that a trial and political battles still lay ahead, Ren smiled. Because for the first time since she was 15 years old, she had a future that was hers to speak into existence. The Oracle Queen. Ren slept for 2 days. When she finally woke, it was to sunlight streaming through windows she did not recognize, and the king asleep in a chair beside her bed, his hand still holding hers, his face drawn with exhaustion. She watched him for a long moment, taking in the dark circles beneath his eyes, the tension that lingered even in sleep, and she squeezed his hand gently. His eyes opened immediately, snapping from sleep to alertness in a heartbeat. And when he saw her awake, relief flooded his expression. You are back. Her throat still hurt, but old Marjorie's treatment had helped. Was I gone? Her voice was hoarse, barely recognizable as her own, but it was there. You were somewhere I could not follow, he said quietly. Even through the bond, I could feel you slipping away. It terrified me. She shifted, tried to sit up, and he was there instantly, helping her, arranging pillows behind her back. Where are we? Greystone. We will leave for the council grounds tomorrow. The trial begins in 3 days, and you need to be strong enough to testify. The trial? Ren's stomach clenched. She had spoken her first truth in 7 years in that great hall, had used the oracle gift without fully understanding what she was doing, and now she would have to do it again in front of the assembled alphas of 7 territories. Will they believe me? They will have no choice. The oracle gift does not allow lies. When you speak truth, they will feel it in their bones. He hesitated, but it will not be easy. Verity has allies who will try to discredit you, who will question your status, your past. You must be prepared for that. Ren looked down at their joined hands, at the way his thumb brushed absently across her knuckles. I was a scullery maid 10 days ago. I do not know how to be a queen. Neither did I know how to be king when my father died. But we learn, we adapt, and we do it together. Over the following days, as they prepared to return to the council grounds, Ren began to understand the scope of what Verity had built. Finn brought reports, testimony from captured conspirators, letters that had been found in Verity's quarters. The conspiracy had reached into 4 of the 7 territories, with allies in court positions, trade guilds, even among the lesser alphas who had felt overlooked by the king's policies. She was planning this for over a decade, Finn explained as Ren read through the documents, her voice growing stronger with each day of use. Since before your village was destroyed. Your mother, as the king's oracle, was the only one who could have foreseen the conspiracy. Eliminating her was always the first step. Ren's hands trembled as she read her mother's name in Verity's correspondence. A loose end, Verity had written. The oracle sees too much. Remove her and the king is blind. She looked up at the king, who was reading over her shoulder. "My mother died trying to protect you." "She succeeded," he said quietly, "because she raised a daughter strong enough to finish what she started." They returned to the council grounds with an armed escort of 50 wolves. The journey took 3 days, and Ren rode beside the king the entire way, no longer as a servant, but as his acknowledged mate. Other travelers they passed on the road stared openly, and Ren heard the whispers. The mute girl, the king's mate, oracle-born. The rumors had already spread. The council grounds had been transformed. What had been a gathering of political rivals was now a trial venue, with the amphitheater arranged for formal proceedings. Alphas from all 7 territories were required to attend, and Ren could feel the weight of their attention as she dismounted, could sense their assessment, their doubt. "She is so small," she heard someone murmur. "How can she be Oracle?" Lady Verity was brought forward in silver chains that suppressed her ability to shift. She looked diminished somehow, her pale hair tangled, her fine clothes replaced with a prisoner's of owner's rough tunic. But when her eyes found Ren, the hatred there was undimmed. The trial began at dawn with owner's rough tunic. But when her eyes found Ren, the hatred there was undimmed. The trial began at dawn the next day. Ren sat beside the king on a raised platform, Finn and Briar flanking them, and the assembled alphas filled the stone tiers. At the center of the amphitheater, Verity stood in chains, and beside her, Ragnar Steelmaw, who had agreed to testify in exchange for exile instead of execution. The accusations were read: conspiracy to commit regicide, murder of the Oracle bloodline, enslavement through magical compulsion, treason against the crown. The list went on, each charge more damning than the last, and through it all, Verity stood silent, her face a mask. Then it was Ren's turn to speak. She stood, her legs shaking, and descended to the amphitheater floor. Every eye was on her, hundreds of alphas and their courts, and the silence was absolute. She had written out her testimony, had practiced with Finn to make sure she could speak clearly despite her damaged throat, but now, standing in the center of this ancient place, the words seemed inadequate. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and reached for the bond. The king's presence steadied her, a golden anchor, and when she opened her eyes again, they were glowing faintly with oracle light. "My name is Ren Ashcroft," she began, and her voice, though hoarse, carried through the stone space. "I am 22 years old. 7 years ago, my village was destroyed by wolves wearing the Coldheart family crest. My mother, Isla Ashcroft, the king's oracle, was murdered because she foresaw a conspiracy that threatened the throne." As she spoke, the truth of her words resonated, undeniable. The alphas shifted in their seats, unable to look away, compelled by the oracle gift to listen. Ren continued, describing the massacre, her voice breaking as she remembered fire and screaming and her mother's last words. "Hide, child. Do not let them find you." She spoke of waking in the castle, with her voice gone, of the 7 years in the kitchens, of the abuse and isolation. She described recognizing poison on the king's food through instinct she had not understood, described the moment the bond formed, the terror and hope of it. And then she turned to face Verity directly. "You bound my voice with a curse. You placed me in servitude. You kept me as insurance, a broken oracle who could see but never speak. But you underestimated one thing. Silence is not the same as powerlessness." Verity's composure finally cracked. She lunged forward, chains rattling. "You were supposed to die in that cellar. You were supposed to burn with the rest of them. But you survived, and you have been a thorn in my side ever since." "So you admit it," the king said, his voice carrying over the assembled crowd. "You ordered the massacre?" Verity laughed, the sound bitter. "Of course I did. The Oracle bloodline was too dangerous, too capable of exposing my plans. I needed them eliminated, and I succeeded. Or I would have if you had not been fool enough to bond with the one I let live." The amphitheater erupted in noise, alphas shouting, demanding order, calling for immediate execution. The king stood, and his power rolled out across the space, silencing them. The defendant has confessed. The oracle has testified. The evidence is irrefutable. What say you, council? What is the judgment for treason and murder? Death, an alpha called from the third tier. Immediate execution. Exile, another. Other countered. Strip her of title and territory and let her live with her shame. The debate raged for an hour. Wren stood silent through it all, her throat aching, her body exhausted. Finally, the king called for a vote. It was nearly unanimous. Death by silver blade, carried out at sunset, with all territories bearing witness. Verity was led away. As she passed Wren, she stopped, her voice dropping low. You think you have won, but you will never be accepted. A mute kitchen girl wearing a crown. They will never forget what you were. Wren met her eyes steadily. Good. I do not want them to forget. I want them to remember that even the powerless can rise, that even the broken can become whole. Verity had no answer to that. She was taken away, and Wren did not watch her die. She had spoken her truth, had seen justice done, and that was enough. 6 months later, Wren stood in the same amphitheater, but this time it was for her coronation. She wore silver and white, oracle colors, and her hair was bound with a circlet that had belonged to her mother. The assembled alphas rose as she entered, and this time the attention felt different, not assessment, respect. The ceremony was long, filled with oaths and rituals, but when the king placed the crown on her head and named her Luna and Royal Oracle, when the crowd roared their acceptance, Wren felt something settle into place. She was no longer the invisible girl counting days in the darkness. She was seen. She was heard. She was free. That evening, as the celebrations continued, Wren slipped away to the forest with the king. They shifted, her transformation still clumsy but improving, and ran through the trees as wolves, side by side. The bond sang between them, gold and unbreakable, and for the first time in her life, Wren felt truly at peace. When they returned to human form beside a frozen lake, he wrapped his cloak around her shoulders. Are you happy? Wren considered the question. Her voice was stronger now, though still rough in the mornings. I am learning to be. Ask me again in a year. He laughed, pulled her close. I will ask you every day for the rest of our lives if that is what it takes. She looked up at him, this fierce king who had saved her and whom she had saved in return. I was afraid I would lose my voice again, that the fear would take it back. And if it does, I will wait in the silence with you, he said, however long it takes. She believed him. And in the years that followed, when historians wrote of the Oracle Queen who brought peace to the Northern Territories after exposing the greatest conspiracy the wolves had ever known, they would begin the tale the same way. Once, there was a girl who lost her voice, and when she found it again, she changed the world. Not with volume, Wren would tell the young oracle she eventually trained, a girl of 15 with prophetic dreams and fear in her eyes. Not with shouting or demanding, but with truth, with persistence, with the refusal to stay silent when silence serves only those in power. The girl listened and learned, and when she left the oracle's tower, she carried with her the knowledge that even the voiceless have power, if they choose to use it. And Wren, standing at the window with her hand resting over her heart where the bond seated itself, felt the king's presence across the castle, steady and sure. She was no longer counting days. She was living them, and that made all the difference.